starting with L Carnitine, I actually have part of it as a question here, which we might get into afterwards. But why would I be able to use that as a natural athlete and it not be considered being unnatural?
Well, it's a dietary amino acid. I mean, would be about as much logic in calling that unnatural as calling a B12 injection would be. It's simply a micronutrient that you're just choosing to administer via an injection. So
Same as someone supplementing with leucine or something like that.
Yep.
Mm. So why L-carnitine specifically, and why would I inject it instead of ingesting it orally?
So oral bioavailability has around about 12 to 15% bioavailability. So in terms of a cost management, you're going to be much better bang for your buck injecting it. A secondary reason is, you might get this abbreviation wrong, but I believe it's TMAO, builds up in the stomach, which is caused by a bacteria. And when you ingest large amounts of carnitine, and I believe choline as well, it increases TMAO, which has some toxic impacts. There's a little bit of research that you'll be able to find on PubMed and whatnot. It's TMAO or MAO, and can have some quite ill side effects in terms of the health side of things. Whereas you bypass that when you're injecting it due to the 100% bioavailability of the injection.
Interesting. And this would be a similar. You mentioned the size of the needles that you used before for that same thing. Would you be able to use the same sort of thing you mentioned before? Like how big did you say they were?
So with the peptides that we were talking about in the last episode, you'd be using generally a subcut insulin syringe, which is about half an inch in length. With the L-carnitine, you could inject with that as well, but it's typically, if you're getting some of the high concentration injectable preparations at the 500 or 600 milligram per mil, it's extremely thick. So you're going to have a very hard time drawing it up into an insulin syringe with a really thin needle. So how I personally administer my carnitine is I use a 1 mil barrel with a 19 gauge screw on, so you can still draw it through a large thick needle. And then I swap out the 19 gauge drawing needle for a 27 gauge half-inch injecting needle, which is ever so slightly thicker and longer than the subcut insulin syringes, but it's very marginal and still a very, very small syringe.
And like same sort of thing though, you could still inject it in the stomach, or do you specifically prefer another area?
Look, you could administer it in the stomach. However, it's most likely going to cause you a bit of discomfort and some welting. It tends to be quite thick and will kind of just linger. It'll just sit there and you'll have a bit of a welt. I typically recommend shallow intramuscular injections with it. So still going into the muscle, but not necessarily having to go an inch or inch and a quarter deep like you would with most of your other kind of oil-based steroid injections and whatnot.
Interesting. Why would there be a benefit? You know what I do, right? So I typically follow a lot of hypertrophy training, which is such a broad term. By the way, it may be pronounced hypertrophy, but I will never pronounce it that way because it doesn't sound right to me. We
Just call it gains.
Gains. Yeah. We'll just call it gains. But if you say hypertrophy, I giggle a little bit. Even if that's correct, I still giggle at it. So I do mainly, if you want to go air quotation marks, bodybuilding. I've taken a slight break due to a muscular tissue issue. I like the way that sounded. But I do normally do jiu-jitsu. I don't mind a bit of running. So I'm never doing anything crazy, but that's the sort of training that I'm doing. Where would you see the benefit for someone like myself? Would you say it would be worth doing?
Yeah, L-carnitine is very versatile. There are quite a few different benefits. The main reason people are going to use L-carnitine is effectively energy system efficiency. It's going to preference fat, or not necessarily preference, but allow fat to be used as an energy source easier. So when you're doing, like, for example, if you're doing a bodybuilding session, you're most likely going to be doing more glycolytic type training during your actual set, where you're using carbohydrates as fuel. But during those rest periods where your heart rate's coming back down, you're hopefully nasal breathing, you're going to be switching more over into that lower intensity or lower requirement for fuel. And during those periods of time, you tend to switch more back over to fat consumption as an energy source. So something like an L-carnitine will make you more efficient at that kind of transfer. between energy systems, as well as having a glycogen sparing effect because you are able to more efficiently use fat when you're not needing that really fast kind of production of ATP from glucose.
Interesting. How often would you inject L Carnitine?
You can get really crazy with it. I have some drug tested athletes that are administering multiple times per day that are really trying to push things, trying to get as much as they can out of the product. Most people that I'll put on L Carnitine will just be one pre-workout injection, just because obviously it is an injection still, and I would prefer see it used over a longer period of time than have someone do this really crazy high-frequency injection protocol where they're maybe doing 3 injections a day and then just be sick of it after 3 weeks and not be able to adhere to it. So typically I just do pre-workout, so maybe 5 times a week, about 30 to 45 minutes before training with a carbohydrate rich meal, because it is better uptaken with presence of insulin as well.
And as you're aware, there's no testing for this sort of thing because it is just simply, as you said,
There's no way you could test for it,
would never be not allowed in any kind of situation.
Yeah.